Are we live? I think we're live. You guys don't need to see my resolve just yet. You want to look at me, right? I doubt that's true, but I'm glad y'all are here just the same. Good morning. Happy Friday. It's Grade School Friday. It's one of my favorite hours of one of my favorite days of any given week. I'm super excited to be with you guys. I'm super excited for the topic that we're chopping up today because it seems like there was a ton of interest in this subject based on the pre-recorded video that we put out earlier this week talking about more cinematic saturation. So I'm super excited to talk about it. It's a huge topic. We could have 10 grade schools on this topic and still only scratch the surface. But I want to go deeper today than we were able to go in the short video that I released earlier this week. And I'm excited to do it with you guys. Hope you got your questions ready. Hope you've been thinking about and puzzling over saturation all week since the video came out. I know I'm always thinking about it and puzzling over it. So welcome to the club. Thanks for being here, guys. As I said, really excited you're here with me. I'm excited to have my buddy Rafa here with me. He's going to help me get everybody's questions answered. And I'm going to plug something probably off the bat here. Let's plug it right now. Rafa, I want to show everyone what you were, the tip that you gave me after the video came out this week. Let's check this out.
Go for it.
So just by way of a quick recap, everybody, and actually we'll knock out two birds with one stone here. The first thing I want to mention, it seemed like everybody was tracking with like how to do this, sort of like specialized HSV node as I walked you through in the video. So I'm basically just right-clicking on a node, selecting color space and going to HSV. And then I'm disabling channels 1 and channel 3 because that's my hue and my value channels. I don't care about those. I just want to work on my channel 2. It looked like there were a couple questions this week of people who were getting odd results. If you're getting odd results, it's because your color management is not set up properly. Because if you think about it, we're selecting HSV here, but as you may know, anytime you're doing any transformation between any two color spaces or color models, you need two pieces of information, right? You need where are we coming from and where are we going? And then we need to know on the back end, when we go back into where we started, same question, where are we coming from, where are we going? The only reason we only have to specify one here is because the where are we coming from and where are we returning to is implicit. It's being defined by how we set up our color management. So if you're getting odd results, go back and check out the DaVinci Wide Gamut Workflow series. And if you've got your color management set up sort of in alignment with what we do in that series, then this will work for you, for any of you guys who are having trouble with it. But just to quickly demo something that sort of like expands on what I was talking about in this week's video. And hopefully now we can all actually see my primaries. Sorry for anyone who got frustrated by not being able to see my full UI this week. Basically, I had my UI situated in a weird way, and we were trying to find a way to make the scopes visible and everything else visible. And we did the best we could. So you'll get to see hopefully a bit more context on what I was doing in that video if you want to get a look at that. And we can start just by looking at what I was doing in the video, where we look at adding gamma to our specialized HSV node, like so. So I'm just pumping it up like that. Maybe. There we go. And then Rafa's cool trick, instead of doing just gamma or just gain, as I was talking about in the video, was to actually kind of play them against each other. So Rafa, will you do something like bringing gamma up and then maybe gain down?
Yeah, that's my go-to.
Is that your move? I love that.
Absolutely.
Move. That feels really good, man. Yeah, so I thought that was a fun one that I hadn't really thought of, to be honest. And it's actually kind of a way of starting to get a, sort of like custom curves type of behavior without having to go in and start noodling with control points. So I thought that one was pretty nifty. Let's see what else before we dive into taking everyone's questions. I just want to think through. Oh, let me start by answering one that is another kind of recurring one that popped up a lot. I got a lot of questions about like, is this the same as, or how does this relate to some, like one of our HSL curves, like our hue versus SAT or our hue versus Loom or our Loom versus SAT? What's the relationship between these curves adjustments and what we're doing? Well, that's kind of complex to answer, but the two key differences are as follows. First of all of these curves here are operating not in the HSV color space, but in the HSL color space, which is quite different. And in fact, just to quickly kind of visually demonstrate, I'm still here in HSV, and gosh, let's go back over to this other image that I was working with this week. And let's just say, we're going to do something like we did a moment ago. I'm just going to add a good, healthy bit of saturation. Let's do Rafa's technique. Let's add some gamma and pull some gain, like so. Okay, so something like that. I'm not going to go as crazy as I did in this week's video, but hopefully it's enough that you guys can see it. All right, so this is saturation in HSV, and then as I talked about in the video, this is going to instantly get a kind of boost or a lift if I can balance things out a little bit more underneath, like so. And I tell you what, let me turn off my kind of global look layer for now, and also just double check my own project settings and make sure that I've got everything set up properly. That's what's weird that I'm seeing here, I think. I'm going to decode my Cinema DNG files here, or actually it's Phantom Cine in the proper way. I think that's going to give me a different decode. Maybe not, actually. Well, I don't know why that's looking funky or why I feel that it's looking funky. Let's try just rebalancing this here in my primaries, just like I did in the video, and then we're going to look at adding this saturation like so. Okay, that's HSV, that's good. Oh, my mistake. My mistake. Now I know what I was doing wrong. I had my wrong mode enabled on my panel here. Let's once again flip into HSV mode. And we will now get what I was after a moment ago of kind of adding some SAT into the image, right? So if we have this, and let's just go further with it, make it nice and exaggerated. So if we have that, and if I go over here to my color space, which we've currently got as HSV, let's just see what happens when I flip it to HSL. Watch the image as I press return here. It totally changes. It's a totally different model. It's one of the themes that I want to talk about today that hopefully we started to illuminate in this week's video is saturation is a moving target. There's no one single explicit definition, at least in the realm of motion imaging for it. So HSL has a completely different definition of saturation than HSV does. So going back to the question of like, how does this custom HSV node that we're doing relate to our, like hue, loom, or SAT curves here in the curve section of Resolve? These curves are all using that HSL model. So no matter what else you do, you're going to get different results just by virtue of that. And then the second thing that I would mention is here in this custom HSV node, right now we're keeping it very, very simple. All we're doing is manipulating our S, or a saturation channel, right? In whatever realm we're in, whether we're in HSV, HSL, it doesn't matter. All we're doing is manipulating the S channel of that model. All these curves down here, they are all creating interaction in between these channels. So in between, in this case, our saturation and our luminance, or our hue and our SAT in the case of something like this. So they're fundamentally different operations. They're creating interactions in between channels, where thus far what we explored in this week's video is just manipulating a single channel without having any interaction between the others. So just kind of a quick answer to one that popped up a couple times is like, well, what's the relationship between these guys and this? It's distinct, it's unique. They have, it's a different model, and it's also a different operation. We're operating on one channel here, and down here we're generally operating on two, although in some cases we are operating on, like with hue versus hue, that's all just the hue channel, or with SAT versus SAT, that's all just the SAT channel. However, there's still the difference between HSL and HSV that is going to produce different results between here and up here in our specialized HSV node. So that's a couple answers sort of off the bat that I wanted to lay out for everybody. And I'll take a breather and see if we've got any questions so far there, Rafa.
Yeah, we have a question from Jim Robinson. HSL, decrease gain in HSL, then add a second node and set it to HSV, remove the extra channels, then bring the gain up, deep saturation that changes and leaves blacks/whites clean. Can you explain why this works?
I can give it to you a sort of brief summary of why that works. All that you're really doing, like, so let's just lab out what Jim is talking about. At least I hopefully I'm understanding what he's talking about. This is a technique where we are essentially going to extract saturation from within one model and then add it back within the other. I'm just making sure I've got all of my pieces set up properly here. And I'm going to turn my look back on because that's going to give me a better baseline to work from here. So if we look at node number 2, which is an HSL node, let me just label these as well so it's easy for us to follow what the heck Cullen is doing. So we got HSL, HSV. In HSL, I'm going to, let's keep it like, really even mathematically. And let's say I'm going to pull 0.5. I'm going to pull my gain to 0.5. And now here in HSV, I'm going to go up to 1.5. The idea here is that we are in effect creating, if we get these sort of like, I'm going to actually do this by hand because again, the sort of scale of saturations is different between these two models. But the idea is that if we extract saturation in one model and add it back in the other, we won't necessarily see a net increase in saturation, but we will see a change in color density, if that makes sense. It's almost like a version of the wipe that we did in this week's pre-recorded video. Now, why this works, there's a complicated answer to that, but the short answer is that the way that saturation is defined in HSL versus the way that it's defined in HSV, and also the way that the other channels are defined, is different. And so it creates, my saturation channel has different contents that are, as a result, affected in a different way depending on which model that I'm in. Easiest way to think about this is like the ground truth in all like present day motion imaging is RGB. That's how images are captured. That's how images are transmitted. And that's ultimately how images are reproduced. Again, I'll emphasize for today. That's something that may change in the near future. In fact, is definitely going to change in the near future. For today, that's the realm that we're in. So anytime we're moving into another model, HSL, HSV, XYZ, it doesn't matter. We are having to come up with the math and say, here is what I think is a reasonable way to derive saturation or luminance from red, green, and blue. Here's a formula I've come up with that either agrees with testing that I've done on human subjects, or it has some sort of mathematical basis. It's all just a sort of educated attempt to derive a channel that didn't exist in the first place. There's, saturation information is not explicitly captured at the site of the camera. That's a channel that we have to derive or define on our own. So the difference between saturation in HSL and HSV and why we get this behavior when we pull sat in one and add sat in the other is because the definition, HSL's definition of saturation is different than HSV's definition of saturation, as are its definitions of luminance and value. So I know that's not probably the most comprehensive answer, but I think that's a sensible sort of portion size for grade school for today.
All right, before moving on, it seems that the bottom end of your screen is cropped in the YouTube live stream, and we cannot see the wheels.
Oh, look at that. Okay. Let me see if I can fix that. The gods of YouTube are really conspiring to keep my wheels hidden. I think I got this figured out here. I think that should work now. It'll take a minute, I think, to update out in the live, but you guys let me know once you start seeing this if that's working a little bit better. And I'll try to keep my scopes kind of popped out. Try to keep scopes, primaries, and my picture-in-picture all visible at the same time. What else we got?
All right. A question from Easy Sonka. Saturation, the saturation button, has the same effect in all colors. Why is it more evident in the reds than in the blues, at least perceptually?
Well, I don't know that I necessarily have that that take. I think if that's your response, you could come up with a number of theories that might potentially explain it. Probably the most simple would be that the color we are most attuned to, most sensitive to as human beings is skin, and skin is, you know, primarily driven by a red channel with a little bit of a green channel. So that may be that why we perceive, we perceive the greatest change in skin. So we feel like, oh, it's the things in and around the hue of skin that seem to saturate more readily than the others. But the other thing that I would point out is, you know, kind of what I emphasized in this week's video, where we say that, like, you know, depending on, like, your balance becomes more and more critical the more saturation that you are adding. So if I start with, you know, whatever, like I've got kind of a slightly cool-ish image in my initial balance, by the time I add this HSV, that gets exaggerated. And all the more so if we're doing the opposite exercise. If we're like, all right, that's got a definite warm push to it, but by the time we add SAT, it just feels all the more exaggerated that way. So one strategy for dealing with that perceptual phenomenon, if you are experiencing it, is just to reevaluate how you are sort of resting or anchoring your balance upstream of that saturation, so that it feels to you that the increase in colors is radiating equally out in all directions, if indeed that's what you want, which generally it would be when we're adding saturation globally to the entire image.
We have a great question here. Is there any way we can manipulate saturation in a subtractive way for a particular color in an image?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually another one that came up a couple times in comments. Probably the easiest way to do that in Resolve is if you go over here to the color warper, and we could go to, like, maybe add a few more pie slices here. I usually like to do 8 or 12. And if you flip your little drop-down menu here into HSV, now, for example, let's say that I want to add red HSV type saturation. I can do that with this color warper, like so. And I wish I could go further there. Oh, I guess I can just crank this knob out further in that direction if I wanted to. But that would probably be the easiest way to do it, is just to, you know, push that saturation out there in the color warper, like so. And you might be surprised at which of these control points kind of like responds better. Like, see, as I'm grabbing these lower control points, I'm getting more action. Another thing that is kind of an important thing to be aware of when you're working with a saturation channel, like we are with HSV here. Saturation channels, even though they're, you know, to use a sort of like color science term, their domain is 0 to 1. So when we calculate my S of HSV channel, it's never going to be less than 0, and it's never going to be greater than 1. Its domain is 0 to 1. However, a saturation value of 1 is incredibly, incredibly rare. Like, you're probably not ever going to get there. If we look at here in our custom curves, if we, you know, pull our, let's go back into our HSV mode here and turn off our channels 1 and 2 like we've been doing. And we look here in our custom curves and just go to our green. How do I actually tell which one is the green channel? I'm going to do something you guys don't need to do, just because I want you to see a clear histogram of this image. I'm going to manually convert to HSV, just to make a quick example here. So we're going to go DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate. This is basically what Resolve is doing for us when we tick that HSV box and right-click our node. I'm just doing it manually so that we can look at the histogram here in our custom curves. So this is our saturation channel for this image. Okay, this is just that green channel. You can see it doesn't get anywhere near 1. So the reason I thought of that just now is because when you're looking at manipulating your saturations here in the color warper, you may find that dragging things out here at the outer edge doesn't have as much effect as you would expect. And that's because there just aren't that many values living out there, if that makes sense. So long way of answering. The color warper is would be the best way of making sort of selective hue or saturation manipulations within HSV.
A question from Nathan. Now that we're going through these color spaces, how do we know which color space is the best to work in when making color decisions?
That is the best question to ask. And this really, goes to this term that I like to think I've played a hand in popularizing of creative color science. It's creative. It's subjective. We have to assess and make that determination for ourselves. And you guys have heard me say this before, that you could think of a piece of color grading software like Resolve as nothing but a big, long list of assumptions, right? Great example. Resolve contains the assumption that the best way to implement saturation is with the math that's used to drive this saturation knob here, right? As we talked about in this week's video, and as I think it sounds like many of you guys agree with me on, I don't share that assumption. I think this is like the last way that I would really want to saturate an image ever. So what's the better one? Well, first we have to realize there's more than one, and or realize there's more than this one. And when we start to realize, wow, there's actually there's like dozens of different ways I could just in a very simple way manipulate saturation in an image. Assessing which one is best is, like a really fun thing to chew on. Rafa and I were just chatting before we started our stream this morning and talking about how my solution is to actually add saturation simultaneously in two different models and then to blend in between them. I was trying all week to remember who said this because it made me laugh so hard. But in one of my creative color science courses, when we were talking about HSV, one of the astute participants in that course noted that when you push HSV too far, I'm going to do this live as I talk about it. They noted that when you push HSV too far, it can start to make skin look, quote unquote, like baked beans. Which I was like, that's the best description I've ever heard for sort of like the outer boundary of HSV for me. We're like, okay, that might be doing great stuff everywhere else in the image, but it's making the skin look like baked beans. So that's why for me, it's often a question of not what's the one model, but like what are two models that I can sort of like modulate in between to find a sweet spot, either on sort of like a global look basis or on whatever individual shot I'm grading. And that's where tool design and, like figuring out how to actually give yourself easy access to those manipulations becomes a really fun part of your color grading practice as well, if you want to dive down that rabbit hole.
Okay. A question from Darius. What is the difference between color boost and saturation?
That's a good question. Color boost is pretty much the most that I've been able to, that I can say about it, that I think can be determined about it, is nonlinear. So saturation, I can give you guys the formula for saturation. I can tell you the exact math that's driving this knob. This is what's called CDL style saturation. This is the saturation that was agreed upon when color decision lists were sort of standardized. And in fact, they didn't come up with that. That was basically saying, what's the oldest, most unanimously agreed upon definition of saturation, dating all the way back to like the days of telecine and like broadcast color correction. This is that same style of saturation. That's why it's still with us. Literally all it's doing is calculating a luminance channel. So remember how we talked a moment ago about how, well, we can come up with reasonable or less reasonable ways to say, hey, if I have a red, green, and a blue of A, B, and C, how can I calculate a luminance channel from that? And one sensible way to do it, the way that it's done in this case, is you say, well, my luminance channel is something like 70% of the green channel plus something like 20% of the red channel plus something like 8% of the blue channel. That's how I define my luminance, is it's just those ratios of however much of whatever the value is of my red, green, and blue channels. That's your one luminance channel. You take that luminance channel, you subtract it from each of your red, green, and blue channels, and then you apply gain to what's left, and then you add that luminance channel that you subtracted back on top. That's the formula that's being used here to drive a saturation adjustment. And I got so excited talking about that I forgot about what the original question was. Run it back for me, Rafa.
What is the difference between saturation and the color boost?
The color boost, that's right. So that's our baseline definition. That's what saturation does. It's just applying linear gain to a rather simply defined saturation channel. It's defining saturation as, well, if this is luminance, then everything that isn't luminance must be color. Okay, like it sort of makes sense, but it also doesn't really work. But that's the definition of saturation. Color boost, you can look at this in the Resolve manual and you'll basically hear the same thing echoed. Color boost is doing a similar thing. It's just not applying gain. It's applying some kind of custom curve function in here. It seems to me that it's still doing the same thing. Calculate luminance, calculate it the same way, subtract it from red, green, and blue, do a thing to what's left, and then add that luminance channel back. The only difference between the two is that the thing that's being done is non-linear as opposed to a linear gain operation. So that's better. And we even talked about that in this week's video where we're like, hey, it's actually probably advantageous in many cases to do something a little more nuanced than just spinning the gain wheel. However, that doesn't overcome the shortcomings of this actual model or definition of saturation, which for my eye visually is just not my favorite. So you can get potentially better results with color boost because you're not just cranking all values at the same strength, but you still have a model that I don't think is perfect for cinematic type images.
A question from Pablo Bonal. Why the vectorscope does not show some saturation changes? I heard it is because of the color model. Can the chromaticity scope be useful as a saturation analysis reference?
It could be the chromaticity scope be useful for a saturation analysis. However, the reason the vector scope doesn't work is the same reason why doesn't always work is the same reason why the chromaticity diagram may not always work. We're looking at a 3D entity in 2 dimensions is why. We're only seeing 2 dimensions of a 3-dimensional realm. So sometimes we're not seeing the change that's happening in the 3rd dimension because we're not seeing that 3rd dimension, at least not fully, inside of a vector scope. So that would be one explanation. The other explanation, human vision is complicated and you can't always predict perceptual effects based on graphable changes in any scope. But the larger issue to me would be that, generally, if you're seeing any kind of saturation, if you're perceiving some kind of saturation change, if you're looking at it in like a 3D cube model, you can easily see it. You can easily see it. And in fact, it's a good opportunity to talk about Omniscope. If you guys aren't already familiar with this, I love this product. I've been using it for a couple months now. And one of the main things that I love about it is getting to look at my image in a 3D cube context here. So now I can see my same signal being plotted in 3D space here. I just wanted to make sure you guys could actually see that. I'll see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Maybe not. Oh, there we go. No. Okay, well, we'll have to... Let me just see if I can do this. And then stretch this out. Oh well, I'm sure there's an easy way to do that I'm overlooking. But suffice it to say, regarding your question, Pablo, a saturation change that you may not be seeing in a vector scope, you're almost always going to see some sort of change in like the 3D graph of your image when you are getting that, when you're making that saturation change. It's just you'll be able to perceive it. You just may need to rotate your cube in order to do so. So that's one of a couple things, but actually the main thing that I'm loving about Omniscope right now is the ability to look at my image graphed in its true 3-dimensional nature as opposed to a sort of derived 2-dimensional version of it. And I'll leave a link if any of you guys are interested in grabbing Omniscope. You can get a free trial to it, and if you do want to pick it up, I've got a code that I can hook you guys up with that I'll leave in the show notes for today. So that's this would be to me the best way to overcome the limitations of not being able to perceive changes on your scopes that you're seeing visually in the image.
All right, another question. Why are we disabling channel 3 in the HSL/HSV node if the relationship between SAT and Luma is what gives us the subtractive saturation feeling.
Ooh, I love this question. So the question is, if the whole magic of HSV is in this sort of subtractive feeling in the way that saturation and luminance interact or don't interact, right? If that's the whole magic of it, if that's the whole value prop, why are we excluding V from the operation completely? Why are we disinviting it from the party? Well, the reason is the beauty of a good color model is that we, the operator, can get better results with less sophisticated manipulation. I don't need to define a complex relationship between luminance and saturation in HSV because that complex relationship has already been defined by the model. So it is literally, in fact, if you guys want to geek out here for a second, I can give you a pretty basic explanation of why HSV works and why it feels saturated. So we already have kind of talked a moment ago. I just happened to touch on like one very common way of defining luminance. If I say, okay, I have red, green, and blue, I need a predictor. I need a definition for the luminance of my image. I need to derive a luminance channel. I gave you a formula for that a moment ago, right? Well, it's about 70% of your green, it's about 20% of your red, and about 8% of your blue. Some variation on that because that doesn't add up to 100%, which you would want. That would be one very sensible way of defining a luminance channel, right? Here would be another really sensible way of defining a luminance channel. Say you have the same scenario. You have a red, green, and a blue value, and you need to produce a value that represents luminance from those. Another very sensible one would be to say, okay, if I have a value of, like, I'm just going to be on an arbitrary scale of 100%, right? If I have a value of 20% red, 30% green, and 50% blue. Another very easy, very simple way to define luminance from that triplet would be to say luminance is just the lowest of the three, right? Because the lowest of the three, that means that there is at least 20%, because red was 20%, that means there's at least 20% colorfulness, saturation in each of those images. So I can pull that out of the equation, basically. I can say, like, that's my achromatic baseline. So that would be what's called like a min RGB scheme, where you say we define luminance as the minimum of red, green, and blue, whichever is the lowest value of those three. Okay, that's the one that is used for. I can't exactly remember which models use that, but here's the other fun way that's also a very sensible way of defining luminance. Luminance is the maximum of red, green, and blue. Whatever the greatest value is, that is my luminance, because that is by definition the strongest of my three channels, the brightest of my three channels. That definition is the one that HSV uses. So if we think of defining our luminance channel or our V channel in HSV that way, and we know that that V channel is now being pulled and set aside from the SAT channel, and the SAT channel has to make do with whatever isn't that V channel, that means that nothing can get brighter than it started, right? Because we've taken the maximum and set it aside, and now we've got to work with what's left, and then we're going to add that back only after we've finished performing our manipulations. So that's the idea there, is that if you come up with the right model, you end up having to do less manual and complex work because the model itself is a better predictor of the results that you want to see. It's slippery stuff, and if that doesn't all track 100%, then you're in good company, because it took me a while for it all to click. But that's the reason, is the model accounts for the behavior that we want, as opposed to us having to manufacture the behavior that we want manually.
You always use balancing first and HSV second. What happens if we flip these nodes? Boost the saturation and then balance, because after the saturation, we can clearly see the color cast in the image, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a short answer. Yes, I do always balance before I saturate, but I think like what we're really asking is there's two pieces to that. There's sequencing, there's node order, and there's process order. Okay, so I mentioned even in this week's video, my balance node is always going to come before my saturation node. However, often when I go in and I add SAT, I will immediately recognize something I didn't quite nail in my balance and then bounce back over to my balance and refine that. However, that balance node remains upstream of my saturation node. So we've talked about this in a couple different contexts here in grade school and other episodes where it's like, well, your order of adjustments may vary or change, or you may even work out of order, but the order of nodes for me is generally not going to change. And I find it to be more sensible to make my balancing adjustments upstream. The other thing you can just sort of keep in mind when we're thinking about that is I generally want a touchier response. I don't want to have to push my controls hard. Because I'm balancing here and then pumping everything here in the SAT, my controls will be more sensitive. They'll be more responsive when I balance here as opposed to here. So that's one of a couple reasons why I tend to do my balancing upstream of my saturation.
Okay, here's a clarification question. Correcting lift gamma gain in HSV actually corrects low, medium, high saturated parts of the image. So then, when correcting with offset, we refer to the whole image?
Yeah, I'm glad we brought this up. So this is something you guys can definitely play with on your own, but I'm going to give you a really good rule of thumb for when you're working in a saturation channel. The rules change a little bit. Like when you're operating in RGB, what's black? Black is whatever you set it to, you know? So like if I go in and I change my lift or I use my custom curves here in a normal RGB node, I'm like, well, black is now higher off the floor than it was before, you know? And no one can tell me I'm wrong. That's not doing a harmful thing to the image. It's literally just a question of whether I like what it's doing to the image. When you are in any saturation channel, any movement that results in this point shifting is a problem. It's a problem because if you think about what you're doing, 0 in a saturation channel, that means 0. That means achromatic. That means no color. If you start adding color into areas that have truly no color, I don't mean areas with very little color, I mean areas with truly no color, you're going to get unexpected results, you're going to get artifacts, you're going to get breakage, because what does it mean to add? How do I know what color I'm even adding to that? If I've got a true RGB triplet of whatever, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, and I'm in HSV and I add saturation to that, what direction is it even going to go in? There's no direction for it to go in because it doesn't have a vector, it doesn't have an axis, it doesn't have any amount of color that I can boost. So when you're in HSV, any operation that moves this anchor point is going to create problems. You can see it happening right now in the achromatic areas on our subject's forehead, for example. So that would include what I'm doing right now, which is basically lift, or doing the equivalent of lift here in the custom curves as I'm explicitly doing. That would also include offset, because offset picks up the bottom of the image, right? So you're going to find and this is, by the way, true of making any manipulation in any sort of alternate color model, there are useful and less useful operations to perform. But in the case of a saturation channel, gamma's fair play, gain's fair play, custom curves are fair play as long as you leave yourself anchored to 0 down here at the very bottom. Offset is going to make for problematic results. Lift is going to make for problematic results. Contrast and pivot, similarly, depending on whether your S curve is turned on or off. So I've got my S curve for contrast turned on here, and that's the default. But in general, I'll leave this off, so I'm getting linear contrast. Same thing. The only way that I can sensibly do this is if I set my pivot to 0, which is really just going to turn this back into a gain knob. Because if I set my pivot anywhere else, that's another way that I'm going to end up grabbing this control point of the S channel and moving it up and creating breakage, artifacts, and problems. So just kind of a quick summary of tools that you should play with versus tools that you really should keep off limits to yourself unless you just wanted to experiment and verify what I've just told you.
A question from Easy Sonka. Have you found any use in some color models that are only available in the color warper, like HSP? Is it possible that you could make some tests?
Sorry, what was the last part? Is it possible that what?
That you could make some tests using the color warper now.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I would say generally no. The HSP and HSP log, they're really, really close to HSL, if I'm remembering correctly. And actually, a fun way to verify that, actually, I'm wrong, because you can see the signal in these different domains is changing. Perhaps I'm not giving the best answer here, because the truth is, like, one of the benefits of like building custom tools like I do is I have means of moving in and out of these models myself, so that I'm not, like with ImResolve, the only access you have if you want to make manipulations in HSP, the only way to do that is here, right? There's no way to flip it. There's no color space for HSP. I don't have that same restriction, so I can tell you in general, the two modes that I use are HSV and an HSL-ish model. It's not exactly HSL, but it's similar to it. And then it's like, yeah, it feels more kind of additive, more sort of video-y. And as I mentioned before, I often find that mixing in between those is where what I want to do, just so that my skin tone is not getting like completely like driven into the ground by it's not getting overly dense as I saturate the image overall, if that makes sense. So to directly answer the question, I would definitely encourage playing with all of these models in the color warper and seeing what kind of results you can get. And it might even be as simple, I forget what this shortcut is. I used to know it when this color warper was 3D LUT Creator. But I've just added, if you just want to play with all right, what does adding gain to the S channel in HSP look like? You could do that by, I held down Command and sort of lassoed all of my 6 outer control points here. And now if I grab my SAT and move it out, that's what I'm doing. I'm adding gain in my HSP model. So that could be one fun way of sort of getting a quick look at a very simple operation within the S channel of HSP, if you wanted to. But again, I think this kind of goes back to Nathan's question from a couple minutes ago. This is all creatively fertile territory. No one should be able to tell you, oh no, it's this one way. It's, you only will need this one color model and the other ones are useless. They're all useful depending on what you're trying to do and on your particular, sort of take as an artist. So I'd say play around with all these things.
All right, well, let's go to another topic from Ayush. How to read the CIE horseshoe?
Well, I assume we're talking about how to read the horseshoe in terms of grading. To be honest with you, I don't really know. I mean, I understand what the horseshoe is. But especially because of the way this works in Resolve, you can see I'm looking at my, sort of post-output graph of my image. It's all bound inside of my Rec 709 gamut. Even if it makes things worse, but even if I could see my full scene space gamut, like I was looking at in Omniscope a minute ago, I just don't find it to be, I find it to be less intuitive, but no more helpful to me than a vectorscope, to be honest with you, because this is not, it's not predicting what a color is going to look like to me any better than the vectorscope does. It's colorimetric, just like a vectorscope does. It's 2-dimensional, just like a vectorscope is. So it's not like I'm getting some new added dimension or context to my image. In fact, I'll go one even further with you and say, I think the CIE horseshoe is really good for helping people get an initial grasp of a color space, because it's much easier to understand a 2-dimensional object than a 3-dimensional object. But as soon as you've sort of used the horseshoe for that purpose of helping you just understand what color space is, I think its utility is pretty limited, because it just deprives us of critical context, of critical information. So that's sort of a very fancy way of telling you I don't really know, at least in a practical sense of how would you use the CIE chromaticity diagram to assess, evaluate, or sort of validate your grading decisions? I don't know. I'm sure there are people who do their grading in that style. I don't use the horseshoe for that purpose. I use my vectorscope or that 3D cube graph and omniscope that I showed you guys a moment ago. Hope that's somewhat helpful, if not completely satisfying.
All right, a question from Marcus. I've been wondering about the order of operation when it comes to the different curves. Can you talk about what curves do you apply in what order and why when creating a look?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll put it to you this way. There's a pretty rapidly approaching edge in Resolve that, like, when I get to a certain point, unless I'm doing like really, really simple look dev or demonstrating something, I'm going to move into other territory. I'm going to start using custom DCTLs or go into Fusion or use other tools for developing looks. But we can do a ton of look dev right within Resolve. So this is a good question to ask, a good conversation to have. The question is about, like, how do you think about order of operations? I'm not particularly precious about it, but I'll just give you one example that kind of comes to mind. If I am, I don't know, let's look at this still life here and let's balance things out a little bit like so. And let's say I want to rotate my yellows a bit more orange. So let's look at, like, actually, I tell you what, let's go to this frame because that's going to be a little bit easier one to do this on. Let's say I want to look at, like, you know, the yellow band in her shirt here, and I want to go kind of more of like a marigold with it, a little bit of a warmer yellow. I could do a hue versus hue thing by, like, sampling that area and then hue rotating just a couple degrees. I actually don't have to go crazy at all. Like 6 degrees totally does it. You can see that vector kind of starting to stand up there down in the bottom. Now, you guys have heard me talk about this before. Anytime you're rotating from a secondary, i.e. yellow, more toward a primary, in this case, like closer toward red, you're going to get more saturation just by the nature of an RGB system. So what I'm going to often want to do at this point is desaturate that same color that I've just rotated. And you could do that here in the same node because, frankly, it doesn't really matter to me the order that happens in as long as the result is clean. And to be honest with you, I don't know. This is in the Resolve manual, and it's something I will update myself on from time to time, but I haven't for a bit. The Resolve manual will actually tell you, of all possible things you could do in Resolve, what sequence do they happen in under the hood. But off the top of my head, I actually don't know if hue versus sat happens before or after hue versus hue, but I don't really care because it's a pretty broad, pretty soft, pretty gentle curve adjustment, and as long as I get the result that I'm after and it's not chattering when I start to play the image, that's good enough for me. So in general, I wouldn't worry too much about order of operations for things like this. If anything, I would say manipulations where you are pulling saturation or decreasing luminance, I would put those further downstream, if that makes sense. Simply because if I, like extreme example, but if I desaturate my yellows, like let's reset this. If I do like an extreme desat on my yellows here, there's now far less for the color corrector to bite into in the next node if I decide, oh, I want to rotate my yellows as well. I've like greatly limited my ability to do that. So anytime I'm pulling saturation or decreasing luminance, I'm going to tend to push those things later in the sort of stack of adjustments. But other than that, I think you can feel pretty free to sequence those things however you want without needing to worry too much about getting better or worse results with one sequence versus another. Hope that's helpful.
A question from Sven. Considering that the HDR palette is color space aware, can you talk about the saturation in the HDR wheels versus the primary saturation? What does the color space aware tag mean in terms of saturation?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask. And to be honest with you, I don't actually know. And this may be even spelled out in the Resolve manual, and I just haven't bothered to look. Here would be my guess. My guess would be that this is using an implementation of LABCH would be my guess. LABCH is a sort of like cylindrical derivation of XYZ. So you move into XYZ and then you move things into a domain where you have a luminance channel and then you have essentially two difference channels, an A and a B channel. And then if you go from there, you can map into a cylindrical space, an LCHAB or an LABCH space rather, which is similar to HSV. HSV is also, it's not a cylinder, but it is a cone basically. So you have a, if you look, from the top, it's an upside down cone is the sort of model that HSV makes. LABCH is more of a uniform cylinder, but that would be my guess, is that under the hood we are moving into XYZ and then into that model, and then saturation is being applied to, in this case, the C channel of LABCH. That would be my guess. I don't know that for sure at all. I could be dead wrong, but it is certainly happening in not just a model like HSV. HSV, you could feed HSV Rec 709, you could feed it Airy wide gamut, you could feed it Da Vinci wide gamut. The formula remains the same because HSV is not a color space, it's just a color model. Something like LCHAB or LABCH, that is both a color space and a color model. So that's a more likely candidate for the way that a color space aware tool set like the HDR palette is the domain where it is applying saturation changes. That'd be my guess there. And we can certainly observe, like, I don't necessarily love what I'm seeing here, but I do think it's more pleasing than, probably what I would get by doing my SAT knob here inside of the primaries. It looks really bad, really fast. And you can see here, this feels like a more accurate predictor of what we would think of as like photographing a more colorful subject, assuming that's the goal. So that would be my guess there with the HDR palette, and actually gives a good reminder for all of us. Like, that's a pretty good SAT knob. That's maybe not the only SAT knob I would ever want, but that's a pretty good one. So, even if you did a sort of like naive version of saying like, all right, I want to do a little bit of subtractive HSV style SAT and maybe a little bit of HDR style SAT, that might be a great way to arrive at a kind of interesting balance of styles of saturation.
Okay, a question from Wery. What is neutral preservation matrix? How to do that?
What is neutral preservation matrix? Maybe we're asking about one of my, I have a 3x3 matrix that some of you guys may have that preserves neutrals. I'm trying to think about how in depth I want to go into that today. It's pretty self-explanatory, to be honest with you. A 3x3 matrix, for those of us who don't know, is basically what an RGB mixer does. It says how much red, how much green, and how much blue are in my output red channel. And then we answer the same question for the green channel and the same question for the blue channel. A neutrals preservation, a matrix, is just a particular combination of how much red, how much green, how much blue in red, how much red, how much green, how much blue in green, and how much red, how much green, how much blue in blue. That's all a matrix is. A matrix which preserves neutrals is one where after you apply that matrix, things that started neutral stay neutral, is the basic idea there. And the way that you ensure that is you basically ensure that each of your sections here sum up to 1. So right now, 1 + 0 + 0 is 1. If I add some blue, you can see my neutrals, stuff like the white here on the board, that's no longer neutral. However, if I do 0.2 here, and then I say pull 0.2 from my red channel, I'm going to end up with neutrals that haven't moved. Even though other things in the image have moved, my neutrals have remained the same. That's the idea there, is a neutrals preservation matrix is one that leaves neutral stuff neutral. And the way you ensure that is you make sure that your individual rows sum up to 1, by whatever combination you decide on.
Is there any way to achieve density without touching saturation?
Well, density is a sort of challenging word because there's an actual rigorous scientific definition of the word density that dates back to like before digital imaging. So yes, like density is literally, just the inverse of transmittance. It's what gets like recorded by a film negative in the sort of scientific sense. But if you're talking about the sort of general meaning that we use for it, where we say we're adding color density, meaning that as stuff gets more saturated colors are getting darker, is there a way to get your colors darker without turning the saturation knob? I mean, sure. Like one example would be, let me see if I have my colloid tools here handy. I may not. No, it doesn't look like I do. But there's an actual slider in my colloid saturation plus tool for color density. So it's not actually increasing saturation, it's just increasing the density of more saturated colors. Or for that matter, I'll go you guys one better. You don't need a custom tool or need to buy something from me. Go to your SAT versus Loom. If you take this control point on the right here, and you drop it down, more saturated stuff's gonna get darker. So that would be one way of going about it. You're not actually saturating anything, you're just deepening stuff. This is a fantastic way to break your image. You can do ugly stuff that then gets artifacty really fast. Also, look at how insane that looks. That's kind of fun. But just, word of caution, you need to take a very, very, very light touch with this. However, that's a very easy way to, as I'm understanding the question, add density to more saturated stuff without actually increasing or decreasing your overall saturation. We got time for a couple more.
Okay, a question from Crafts. How saturation works in the RGB mixer? And how can we use the RGB mixer in a better way?
Yeah, so in the RGB mixer, there's no actual saturation knob, as we can see here. But let's just try something out here. If I add if I turn my red to 1.1, my green to 1.1, and my blue to 1.1, I've effectively created saturation. And here's the bummer. This is actually exactly the same thing. Well, I won't say exactly because I don't have that much confidence in my color science skills. But let's just do a quick test. So I've added 20% to each of my channels here. Let's grab a still of that. And you can see that's adding saturation. Let's turn that off. Let's go to our SAT knob and let's add 20% of 50, which is going to be 10. Let's add 60. Hey, it turns out I do know what I'm talking about, kind of. So, dead match, right? So if you uniformly add to each channel in your, you add X% to your red in red, X% to your green in green, and X% to your blue in blue. That is, you could call that a saturation matrix, and that is mathematically identical to adding the same measure of saturation using your saturation knob. So this is just one form of matrix, and I talk about matrices a lot in my creative color science courses and elsewhere. There's other matrices you can create that do lots of other interesting things, including saturating the image in other ways. But at the baseline with a 3x3 matrix like we have here, that's sort of a fun trick to know that, oh, I can make a matrix that does nothing but saturate, but it's actually just reproducing one-to-one the behavior of the saturation knob here inside of Resolve. Let's do one more.
Here's a question that might be good to rank it up. What do you think is the most often misunderstood concept about saturation?
That is a really good one to wrap up on. I think the most misunderstood concept about saturation is, I started this week's video talking about this. Saturation is hanging out down here in our primaries. And I feel like I'm always talking to you guys about how we want to max out those primaries. We really want to leverage them fully before we start doing other fancier stuff inside of Resolve. Here's the biggest misunderstood concept of saturation that I'm going to propose to you. I can't prove that I'm right, but you can't prove that I'm wrong. Saturation is not a primary. It's not a fundamental operation. Saturation is something else. So it is not the first thing that I think of. It's more a secondary to me. My go-to when I get a note from a client saying, oh, I want more saturation, I'm not looking for what color model I'm going to do what operation in to add sat. I'm thinking about other things. I'm thinking about some rules of thumb I've talked about in the past. If a client tells me it's too saturated, we had a question about this earlier. Why is it that saturation feels like it affects red more readily than cooler colors? You could sort of take that same logic and apply it in reverse. If a client feels that that an image is too saturated, oftentimes the image is just too warm and it just needs to cool off and it will feel less saturated. And the same thing is true in reverse. If a client feels that an image is too desaturated, oftentimes it's just too cool and it needs to be balanced. So that's one of the first things that I think about when the question of, oh, where's your saturation at? I think about my balance. And then I also think about my contrast because as we know, where you park your contrast, adding contrast has a direct impact on saturation when you're in RGB. Look at my vectorscope. I'm expanding this out as I add contrast, right? So that's another thing that I just try to be aware of is like, all right, maybe I need to implement a different kind of contrast or adjust my contrast in such a way that it's not adding or extracting saturation in a way that I don't want. That's another example of where my mind goes when the word saturation comes up when I'm with clients. It's not that I never will make a literal interpretation and reach for a sat knob, but it's not my first choice because I tend to think of it as, somewhere in between primary and secondary. Maybe it's not quite a power window or a curves adjustment or something like that. But to me, it's really not a primary because, think about color timers. Color timers somehow found a way to deal with images shot by shot in a movie without having a saturation knob. They didn't have that at their disposal. All they had was red, green, and blue, offset, and printer points. That doesn't mean we should restrict ourselves to only what they had, even though we have better stuff. But what it does mean is we should only use more complicated stuff if and when it's needed and if it indeed is getting us better results. So that to me is the most misunderstood concept. Saturation works best. What's the best saturation hack? What's the best way to use saturation? In my opinion, not at all. Like if you can avoid it, if you can accomplish your goals without using it, that means that when you do use it, you're going to have much better success because you're only relying on it when it's needed and to do things that really serve your image well. So I think that's a great one to wrap up on is, I look for ways to avoid saturation in any form just because there often is a way. And if you can find it, then it's generally going to be preferable. And I guess the last thing I would add to that is sometimes it may even be that you need to skip over the kind of intermediate, space between primary and secondary and identify all right, you feel like it's too saturated. Is it just one thing that's really, really glaring at you that is distracting you? That's often the case, in which case it may be time to actually break out a secondary like a hue versus sat or even a power window to knock something down into a better register. Or is it a question of you don't want everything boosted. You really want to emphasize that feature, in which case, again, you might want to skip right over a global sat knob and target, a secondary adjustment that's really aimed at what's bothering either you or the client. So just some thoughts for you guys about sort of expanding your lens on saturation. And I talk about this all the time. Anytime there's a conversation around an aspect of the image that we have a physical knob for, you want to be careful not to be too literal. Being literal is the death of a creative person, right? So if you hear the term saturation, make it a concerted effort to say, well, I may indeed end up turning a knob that's called saturation or manipulating a channel that's called saturation, but that doesn't mean I have to. That doesn't mean that's my only option just because that word aligns with a knob that I have. Think about other options, and that's another huge way to kind of expand and nuance your grading practice. And I think that's a pretty great way to round out a conversation on saturation for now that I hope to revisit with you guys in the near future because it's a big one. It's one of my favorite ones, and it's a huge part of creating really compelling grades. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here this morning. Always fun hanging out with y'all. Thanks for your great questions. Thanks for caring about this stuff as much as I do. Thanks to Rafa for joining me and for that cool trick about playing gamma and gain against each other. I'm going to employ that in my next grade, more than likely. I hope you guys have an awesome weekend. We'll be back with a new video next week and another episode of Grade School next Friday. I will see you then. Take care.